Let me pray, and I want to hear you guys' thoughts for the worst possible question that you can ask. Lord, thank you for this this morning and the classes we've been able to have, Ecclesiastes, and then looking at Joshua, and just pray that you'd continue to teach us from your word. Lord, we thank you for who you are. In your name, amen. All right, give me some thoughts. What's the worst possible question you can ask? Yeah. Okay, what if my life has no purpose? That's a pretty bad question, right? Maybe, and I feel like a lot of the bad questions could spur you in a good place. You know, if you're like, what if my life has no purpose? Maybe you then explore if it does. But I agree, if you looked at that pretty negatively, that might be bad. Other thoughts? Yeah.
What do I do if God isn't real?
Ooh, what do I do if God isn't real? That's a good one. Bad one. I guess, I don't know. What would you do if God wasn't real?
Make as much money as I could.
Uh-huh. So, there you go. What would you, I'm trying to think, is that the worst possible question you could ask in life? What would I do if God isn't real? I guess it would lead to another question. Is God real? That's kind of the foundation of that question is God real? Which, again, it's kind of like this other question I would say maybe is actually a really good question to ask. But maybe if you come to the wrong conclusion, then you'd go in the bad direction. Other thoughts? Worst possible question? Yeah.
I don't know if this is kind of a thought I had. Not sure if it's quite this, but I'm trying to think of how to word it.
Yeah.
Basically, something along the lines of, would the world be the same if I wasn't here?
Yeah, would the world be the same if I wasn't here? That sounds like a movie. I feel like there's some movies made off that kind of theme. Yeah, again, I could see that could be a pretty negative question. Maybe it would spin off some good thought about life, and yeah.
I'd probably say, what does God need from me?
Ooh, why would you say that? I like that.
Just kind of leads you along the line of that. The right answer is God doesn't need anything from
Okay.
you. He doesn't need any of us, and so that can go pretty dark places.
Yeah, I like that it kind of maybe takes you into kind of the wrong thinking about God. Yeah.
The hardest one I get is the broad question of who cares. It's hard to find footing in that conversation.
Okay. Yeah.
If I'm not here anymore.
Yeah, who cares? Yeah, that's a good one. Especially if you're having a conversation with somebody and that's what they throw out, who cares? You're kind of well, obviously not you. So what do I do? What do I do? I like this question. I actually heard this question and this person's answer for the first time from a guy probably almost 20 years ago. I was pastoring a church in Green Bay, Wisconsin, and come on, Pack, all you Minnesota folks, you Pack fans? Yes, thank you. Vikings? No. I know. Anyway, I was at this church, and a pastor had come up from Louisiana right after, I think it was Hurricane Katrina that had gone through, massive hurricane that did so much damage down there. And he came and he said, it was really wild seeing people's response to this natural disaster. I mean, everybody was caring for each other and loving each other in ways he'd never seen before. People's dogs were stuck on their roofs of their houses, and people are risking their lives to save someone's dog and all this stuff. And he said it was really amazing for about a week, just the amount of care and love and compassion of people for each other, inviting people into their homes. You can come and stay where I live. And he said after about a week, something started to change. And he kind of posed it this way, which was interesting as I started looking at Ecclesiastes. He said people started asking a different question. Initially it was, is my neighbor okay? Is your dog okay? Do you have a place to live? These kinds of questions. But pretty soon that question started changing, and he said it basically changed to this. And I think this is actually where Solomon ends up going with his life. Worst possible question you can ask in life: what's in it for me? What's in it for me? And it was interesting because he said as soon as people started asking that question, down in Louisiana, hurricane, flooding, they started saying, well, what am I going to get out of this? It started changing everything. People started looting buildings. People started not worrying about how their neighbors were doing, but making sure they had what they needed. They were fighting. There was just craziness that really lasted for months as that question began to be the primary question people were asking in life. It's interesting. I mean, you can think about life when you begin to put that question at kind of the hub of your life, the center of your life. What's in it for me? What do I get out of this? You begin to destroy the people and the places you're in. I mean, if you think about it, you think about like a family. If you're asking that question with like your siblings or your family, what's in it for me? You kind of make it hard to live with. You ask that question in a relationship with a boyfriend or girlfriend. Well, what do I get out of this? What's in it for me? And it's not long before you ruin that relationship. You ask that question in a marriage, and to be honest, you're probably going to ruin your marriage. Ask that question in a church. What's in it for me? What do I get out of this? And that's often the attitude that people go into church. What am I going to get out of this? And you ruin a church. You ask that question at Anchor House for a school year. Well, what do I get out of this? What's in it for me? If that's like the primary question, of course, does that question come to mind? Sure. But if that's the primary central question that you're asking every day here at Anchor House, just so you know, you'll ruin your time here. And you'll ruin the community that you live with. Because that question at the hub of your life absolutely drives life insane. We actually weren't meant to have that as the primary question in life. What's in it for me? It's interesting. Look at Ecclesiastes chapter 1, verse 3, and you actually see Solomon beginning to ask this question, or at the root of his kind of thought process is this question. He says, meaningless, meaningless, everything is meaningless, says Kohelet. Verse 3, he says, what does a man gain? What do I get? What does a person get for all his toil at which he toils under the sun? For all his work, just kind of a little definition there, yithron is this word for gain. It's like what's left over, what's the profit? When I put everything out there, when I give what I'm going to give, what do I get back? That's the question of what do you gain. It's used 10 times throughout Ecclesiastes, almost always opposite this word meaningless. And so you see a connection there. Amal is the word for toil, but it's not just like working hard, like in the Bible, like Adam and Eve were meant to work. It's actually this dark side of toil, this like laboring and striving. 23 times used throughout Ecclesiastes. And then it uses this phrase, under the sun, seemingly, and we're going to hear that a number of times. He's not like looking at the world and saying, here's what I think is true in heaven, and here's what God said. He's like, when I look at this world and what happens under the sun, he's like, what do I get out of it anyway? What do I gain? And we're going to begin seeing that question as a primary driver in Solomon's life. Here's just kind of going through the book a little bit. Chapter 1, verse 3, he says it there. What does a man gain from all his labor? Chapter 2, verse 3, I wanted to see what's worthwhile for men to do. What do they gain? 2:10, and this was the reward for my labor. This is what I gained for my labor. 2:11, nothing was gained under the sun. 2:15, what do I gain by being wise? 2:22, what does a man gain for all his anxious toil and striving? 3:9, what does the worker gain from his toil? 4:4, all labor and achievement spring from the man's envy for his one another. What does he gain? 4:8, there was no end to his toil, his labor, yet his eyes were not content with what he gained, with his wealth. For what am I toiling for, he said. 5:11, as goods increase, so do those who consume them. And what benefit, or what do you gain? What does the owner gain? 5:15, he takes nothing from his labor that he can carry in his hand. 5:16, what does he gain since he toils for the wind? 6:8, what does a poor man gain? 6:11, what does it profit anyway? So it kind of goes on and on and on throughout the book. That's going to be a theme we'll hear over and over again. What do you get? Like, what do I gain? And I think it's a really tricky one because it's so easy to slip into our mind. Our culture drives you to ask that question. What's in it for me? What do I get out of this? And it's not, it doesn't feel initially like a bad question to be asking. And there's probably places where it's okay to say, hey, is this worth it? You know, that's a normal thing. Like the Bible tells you, count the cost. Like, do you do this? Well, count the cost. What's it going to cost? Is it worth it? There's a place to ask that question. But when that becomes the driving question in your life, what do I get out of it? What do I gain in the end? It begins to distort everything you do. Think about Solomon and God's question to him as a young kid. God says, I'll give you whatever you want. What do you want? As a king, as a new king, ask what you want and I'll give it to you. It's like God saying, what do you want to gain? What's Solomon's response? Give me a hearing heart. Give me a heart that'll hear and do what you want. And you see that his attitude initially is not, wow, good, what can I gain? His initial attitude has to do with what does the Lord gain? What's in it for you? But somehow, slowly, we saw that change. As you read through Kings and Chronicles, you see that start to change in Solomon's life to this idea of what do I get? As I said earlier, I think it's actually super fitting to teach about Ecclesiastes here on Kauai, or where I live, up in kind of a resort town, mountains of Colorado. People make it a destination. I want to live in Colorado. I want to live in Grand County. I want to live at a ski resort. I want to ski all winter, and I want to, bike all summer. And the mindset can be all about, what do I get? What's in it for me? And it's amazing living in a place like that to see people as they live there and as they had that dream and they built their multi-million-dollar house and they ski every single day, and yet they're not happy. They've gained everything they worked for, and somehow it's destroyed their marriage, it's destroyed their kids, it's destroyed their bank accounts, it's destroyed their faith, it's destroyed their dreams, and they're depressed, they get drunk every night, and they don't know how to live their lives. And it's like, but they have everything because the question was wrong. Again, we're going to see Solomon as he has this question at the hub of his wheel. It's like there's a crack there. And no matter what he tries to fix it, to put in a place, it's not going to work. It's going to end up leaving him in this place of meaningless. Everything's meaningless. Let's jump into the first kind of dilemma that he faces, the first kind of challenge as he's looking at life. And we're going to see this question that's driving him is, what does a man gain? What's in it for me? But he's going to look at kind of 4 major areas of life that when he's asking that question, they just kind of throw his life off kilter. And it just doesn't work out. I'm going to play a song that'll kind of introduce us into the first one. This is a well-known kind of old school hymn that many of you will know. And so again, like I said before, I want you to listen to the song. How does the artist want you to hear this song? What's kind of the vibe? And then I want you to think about the words. And we're not going to spend too much time talking about it. It's a song many of you have heard before. But this will kind of introduce us into this first category.
I
Okay. Give me some thoughts, just generally. You guys like all like half asleep now. That's really nice. The vibe of the song, especially how that artist sang it. What do you think of? What's that? Okay, yeah, definitely beauty. It kind of has this just beautiful sound to it. Yeah.
Kind of like in awe.
Yeah. Like I think of, when I hear that, I think of like Lord of the Rings, like the elves going through the woods. This kind of like this awe, just amazing, kind of ethereal. Yep.
Joy.
Yeah. Like somehow there's like this kind of like, not sad, but like a peaceful, but there's also like a joy to it in even instrumentation and that sort of thing. Yeah, how about the words? I mean, kind of well-known old school hymn. Any words stick out to you that the artist, here's what the author is trying to express through this song? Yeah.
Just the line, then sings my soul like my Savior God, how great you are, right?
Yeah.
The chorus it's so iconic, but I was just thinking about it in relation to what you were talking about earlier. It's like she's saying that God's creation like satisfies my soul.
Yeah, interesting. Yeah, so as she looks at God's creation, and I almost like even when she says, then sings my soul, makes it sound like it's almost involuntary. Like it's not even like something that she's doing, it just comes out of her as she sees God's creation. Yeah, good. What else? Yeah.
I like how she kind of tells you what she's thinking for beauty, what the wood, the green,
Uh-huh.
the trees, the brook, the lofty mountains.
Yeah.
And it kind of puts you in that place.
Yep, and it's kind of cool, like the instrumentation kind of fits them. Like the first verse has to do with like big things, like this grandeur, and you have this loud music, kind of almost like thundering. And then it's like this brook and this, and you have like, there's actually some little like bird kind of noises, like little flute. Yeah, and so you kind of can feel yourself there. This picture of beauty, and I think throughout Scripture, now obviously some people could maybe be too obsessed with nature, and we've seen that happen, right? Where they actually worship, and Romans talks about that. You worship the creation rather than the creator. I don't think the author is going there. I think that could happen. But it's one of the things throughout Scripture that we see nature itself is supposed to draw us to the Lord. I read this verse actually on the beach when we got here. We got out here on Friday, Saturday morning. I was sitting on the beach, and Naya and I decided we were going to have like a photo competition this week. So we're like taking pictures, and at the end of the week, we'll go home and like take our top 10, and then my wife and my son will judge who won the photo competition. And I was sitting there, and I'm reading this verse in the Bible in Psalms. It was awesome. It says, God makes his wonders so that they could be remembered. And I thought that was such a cool verse. God makes his wonders so that they would be remembered. And it was like, wow, like taking a picture of something is actually part of fulfilling its purpose for being made. Like it's being remembered. And really the heart is that we remember God's character and his creativity. And so there's this beauty that we see in creation that it should like draw us to the Lord. It's interesting because this is actually where Solomon starts. After he finishes kind of this dark beginning, meaningless, something meaningless, and then he comes into this kind of this poem. He says, the sun rises and the sun sets and hurries back to where it rises. Okay, you guys experience that every single day. The sun rises, you're kind of cool. You live in a place where you can like see it. There's on the ocean over there. There it goes on the ocean over there. And it just keeps going round and round. And thankfully, right, that you can kind of count on it. The wind blows to the south and turns to the north. Round and round it goes, ever returning on its course. You guys experience that here, probably way more than we even do in Winter Park. I mean, you guys, the wind currents are totally tied into the land masses and into what's happening in the ocean. And if you're a surfer, you're like watching that stuff. Okay, where's the wind going? Is it offshore? Is it onshore? What's happening here? All streams flow into the sea, and yet the sea is never full. Again, I love Kauai. What a great place, to think about Ecclesiastes. You look at some of these streams that are running off the island, off the peaks, and there's like tons of water flowing down this. Yet the ocean never fills. It's never like overflowing. And so Solomon's kind of making some comments on this. To the place the streams come from, there they go again. Which again, crazy. You've got an island and the water just keeps coming up or raining down on it and going. It's cool because really Solomon is recognizing some of kind of the classic aspects of nature well before they were discovered kind of by the modern era. The first one, he's talking about the sun. Did he get this fully? Probably not, but I think about this idea of the earth, rotating on its axis, but also orbiting around the sun, and just how amazingly perfect this happens, right? Like if it didn't work, if it didn't happen the way it does in reality, our earth wouldn't be the way it is right now. If it was too far from the sun, it'd be too cold. If it was too close, it would be too hot. Even the way that it rotates in kind of our 24-hour day is like perfect. I was looking up kind of how that works with the kind of the sun cycles, and just like we have a 24-hour day. The moon has, I think it's about a 2-week day and night, like the moon's rotation. During the daytime temp on the moon, it's 250 degrees Fahrenheit, and their nighttime temp is negative 208. So just rotating a little bit slower, 2 weeks, a lot slower, than 24 hours, and and I don't even know, like, if it was a 30-hour day, would it be too hot during the day and too cold at night? I don't know. But 24 hours seems like perfect, where it cools down during the day and it warms up at night. And then you've got this orbit around the sun where you have, because of the tilt of the earth, you've got summer and winter. Our Alaskan friends have a really long, days in the summer and really short days in the winter. Here, it's kind of in between. But, if it was tilted more than that, the ice caps would be huge on the opposite sides. Or if you had no tilt, it would be like the weather would just be the same, kind of depending on where you were on how the days. And so it's kind of beautiful how God did this. It makes us say, wow, God, you're awesome. Like that song, How Great Thou Art. The other thing Solomon mentions in Ecclesiastes is this idea of wind. And I don't know how much, we think about wind with surfing. You think about wind in a lot of different ways. But actually, wind is essential to having like fresh air and to having like a good climate on this planet. You've got heated around the equator, and the air heats up, it rises into the air, and that creates a vacuum. And so cool air from up north is then drawn down, and as this cool Arctic air comes down, it begins to warm up, and then it goes up, and it starts heading up north, and then it created a vacuum when it moved down, and it just cycles. It's like a giant air conditioning system on our planet, which is pretty amazing. If we didn't have that, our air would be stagnant. It would just stay hot in areas like Hawaii, and it wouldn't get the cool breezes that blow through. It's pretty amazing. And then, of course, Solomon mentions the kind of the water system. I remember my son and daughters drawing these when they were in elementary school, and he talks about this idea of like water. It falls and it goes down to the sea or to a lake or whatever, but then it like doesn't overflow. It goes back up, and it goes and returns back to where it was. And so Solomon's kind of mentioning the beauty of all these things. And I think about that song, like, wow, God, how amazing you are, how great you are. It's supposed to, creation is meant to draw us to how awesome God is. I even think, and I love the way this song ends. I don't know if you ever noticed this, those of you guys who sung this song. The last verse is very different from the rest of them. Why do you think he goes there on the last verse, the author?
Because the whole first part is showing God's glory and majesty and strength and everything like that's bigger than us.
Uh-huh.
And yet in the last verse it's showing God's humility and
Yeah.
how he's doing these ugly things for us.
Yeah.
Do it, and he can't understand that. He can't.
Yeah. I love that contrast. I don't know how much you guys think about this, and honestly, this is one of the greatest gifts for living a year here in Kauai. That when you look at nature, when you see how incredible our God is, and to be honest, I've been a lot of places around the world, and I'm blown away by Kauai. I mean, and you guys experienced that. You're probably somewhat used to it now, but it's like amazing driving around and seeing these places, and you're like, whoa, God, you are so big. The amazing thing as a believer is every time you see how incredible God's creation is, it should remind you that God came and died for you. Like that God who created that God who is so powerful to make this world actually died on the cross for you. Like, that's crazy. There's this beauty. I think that's where the artist is going with the song, is he paints the beauty of creation, how great thou art, how great you are, God. And then he comes to the cross and he's like, and actually, when I recognize how great you are in creation, it reminds me of how important I am to you because you died for me. And actually, as a believer, we go even farther than that. We recognize that God gave his own life, his spirit to dwell in us. So actually, when you look at Kauai and you look at the waves and how powerful they are, or the mountains, and you're like, whoa, God, you are awesome. And that reminds me that in your eyes, somehow I am awesome. You'd be willing to die for me. You care about me that much. Whoa, that's incredible. And I believe that that same God who made all that lives in me. Wow. It just like lifts you up. But of course, if what we said about Ecclesiastes is true and it's not some just encouraging book about how life should be, we could guess that Solomon doesn't go there. Again, he says, sun rises, sun sets, it hurries back to where it rises. The wind blows to the south and turns to the north. Round and round it goes, ever returning on its course. All streams flow into the sea, yet the sea is never full. To the place where the streams come from, there they return again. Amazing things. If those things didn't happen, we would die. Like great things. What do you think Solomon's point's going to be? If he's saying meaningless, meaningless, everything is meaningless. Any guesses on what his point's going to be with the beauty of creation? At least what he says here. Yeah.
It's very complex for something meaningless.
Okay. Pretty complex for something meaningless. Yeah.
It seems like it's becoming just routine, it's mundane, it's the same thing.
Yeah. It's repetitive. You know, if you read this with like more of a darker tone, sun rises, sun sets, hurries back to where it rises again. Same thing every day. Wind blows, round and round it goes, ever returning on its course. All streams flow into the sea. The sea is never full. To the place where the streams come from, there they return again. Life just goes on and on and on and on. And it's like, yeah, that's a good thing. But Solomon's looking at it and he's saying, it doesn't matter what you do. Everything just keeps happening. No matter what you do. He goes on from there, he says, all things are wearisome, more than one can say. The eye never has enough of seeing, nor the ear its fill of hearing. I think that's connecting to the sea. You know, we never see enough, we never hear enough, we're never satisfied. What has been will be again, and what will be done again. There's nothing new under the sun. Is there anything of which one can say, look, there's something new? It was here already long ago, it was here before our time. There's no remembrance of people of old, and those who are yet to come will not be remembered by those who follow them. Ultimately, he says, when I looked at life and I looked at nature, I saw that nature and this world just goes on and on and on, and it's the same thing every day. And it doesn't matter what you do, you can't change it. You live your life, your 60, 70, 80 years, and then you die. And everybody will forget you. He's like, you might be remembered for a generation. You might even be remembered for 2. But you will be forgotten, and everything you worked for will be forgotten, and you actually didn't change anything in this world. You were just a piece of this ongoing process of humanity, of life, and it just happens, and you can't get out of it. There's nothing new. Nothing changes. You're like, but there are all sorts of things new. I mean, I think of like my phone, like this is so cool, like all the things it can do. It doesn't really do anything new. Sure, it's a new way of doing old things, but it doesn't really meet our needs, does it? I mean, I think of like communication itself and how, you know, whether you go from smoke signals to like fire pillars on top of mountains to horses where people would carry mail to like, when I grew up, it was like everything was a corded phone connected to your wall. And I remember when they first came out with like cellular devices and people were like, this is going to solve our communication problems. This will solve your time issues. Now you can do your work faster, more efficiently. You can do it and you'll have, basically the promise was you'll have more time for your family, more time for the people around you because this device will let you get your stuff done faster and your relationships will be deeper. Has this solved that problem? No. Now, I'm not against technology. But the reality is technology does not, it's always asking the same question. How do we do it better? How do we do it more? And the reality is most of the time, or a lot of the time, technology actually makes it worse. We just work more. This device has not given more people time with their family. I would say, if you took it across the board, I would say this device has taken away people's time with their family. Having high school kids, and I don't mind them having phones, it's part of life, and there's some great things, communication, but man, we've lost a lot of time with our kids because of this, and not just our kids' phones, but actually mine. Because I can do work anytime during the day, at home. I can play games. I can, watch movies. Great gift, but it doesn't answer my problems in life. It doesn't solve the same questions that we have. If man is looking for something new to get him out of the meaningless cycle of this life, there's no worldly gadget that will satisfy his desire for freedom. Like, you just can't get it. And so the first dilemma that Solomon kind of faces and kind of talks about, this dilemma number one, it's really the insignificance of life. No matter how much you try to change the world. This is from Solomon's perspective. Again, and remember, it's a whole song, so it's going to be kind of start pretty dark. It's going to actually get even darker and darker, and then we're going to start seeing him come into the light. But from his perspective, as an old man looking at life, he's like, you are an insignificant nothing. You think you're changing the world, but you're not. You think you're helping people in poverty, but they will still be in poverty. Other people will take their place. You think you're going to be remembered and you did something great. Nobody's going to remember you. Eventually you'll be forgotten just like everybody else, but the world will keep going and new people will be born. Life is insignificant. That's going to be his first dilemma. The first thing when he's saying, okay, what's in it for me? What do I gain? What do I get out of this life? Do I get significance? Is it like I can end my life saying, wow, I really changed something? And from his perspective, looking at what do I get under the sun? What's in it for me? He's like, no. In the end, I didn't get anything. I was not significant. I didn't change anything significant. So he's going to go on from there. Ecclesiastes chapter 1, verse 12. He's going to hit his second one. He says this, I, the teacher, was king over Israel and Jerusalem. I devoted myself to study and to explore by wisdom all that's done under the heaven. Now, just kind of maybe a leading question. Why would he go from, or any ideas why he'd go from significance, like you can't change anything, okay, the world just keeps going, you can't actually make it change, you can't, you won't be remembered. Why would he go from there to maybe focusing on, well, maybe study, maybe understanding the world is the answer? Any ideas on why? Because I think there's a progression. What's that?
Maybe you can manipulate it.
Okay. Maybe if I understand it more, then I can change it. Okay, that could be. Yep. Any other thoughts? Why go from, yeah.
Maybe he's just starting a cycle of looking every possible place for an answer.
Okay, so maybe he's kind of said, okay, I've tried these normal things, and it's like, well, maybe I need to get more in-depth study. Maybe I need to figure out somewhere in there's got to be an answer. I like that. Other thoughts? Why would he go from significance, really leadership in some ways, changing the world, to studying, understanding? I think it's kind of in some of the things you guys are saying there. I think it's our natural response when you can't affect something, you can't change something. It's kind of like the back door to owning it, to changing it, is to just fully understand it. I don't know if you guys have ever seen a storm chaser, like people who, love chasing hurricanes or tornadoes or whatever. And it's crazy because you talk to somebody who's like a storm chaser, they have no control over the tornado. I mean, there's nothing they can do to stop it from moving. But you talk to them, and sometimes it can sound like they have full control over it. Because they know so much about it. Or maybe a more common example is, I think of like if you have a favorite band. One of our staff guys loves Coldplay. He knows every single thing there is to know about Coldplay. And I wouldn't say it's like his way of kind of owning Coldplay, but he definitely would say they're my band. That's my band. And he knows their birth dates, the guy's birthday. He knows every album. He knows all this stuff. And it's like kind of a round the back way of feeling like you kind of own something, control something, is you know enough about it. And so I think that's where Solomon's going. He says, you can't change the world. Well, maybe I can kind of sit outside the world and study it and understand it. I devoted myself to study, to explore by wisdom all that's done under the heaven. Just an interesting little note here. This word to study, to see, or to observe is a super common word in Hebrew. This is how many times it's used in different books of the Bible. So like Genesis there, it's used over 280 times. Here's Job, which is interesting. It's used, around 200 times. Here's Ecclesiastes right here. All right, so kind of mid-range, like how much the word to study is used in Ecclesiastes. But what's different from Ecclesiastes to like Genesis? What's the difference between the two books?
180 times.
Okay, the number of times it's used.
Genesis is a longer book.
It's a much longer book. So if you did the same study by how many times it's used per word in the book, see Ecclesiastes? And it gives us a little bit of an idea of some of the mindset going into this book of Ecclesiastes is Solomon saying, okay, this is what I can see and study. He's not saying this is what God's told us. He's not saying this is what the Bible tells me. He's saying, I took my time to study this world, to try to understand it, to observe it. And over again, that's going to be his focus is here's what I see under the sun. What's going to be his conclusion? As he looks at this world and he explores everything that's done under heaven, what's his conclusion? He says, what a heavy burden God has laid on man. When he studied the world, okay, I can't change the world, maybe I can understand it. He says, what a heavy burden God's laid on men. Why would he say this? Let's look at the next few verses. He says, I've seen all the things that are done under heaven. All of them are meaningless, a chasing after the wind. What is twisted cannot be straightened. He's like, as I've studied, kind of similar to the first one, I looked at things, and it's like what's twisted, what's messed up, people try to straighten and they can't figure it out. What's lacking can't be counted. If something doesn't have what it needs, nobody's able to provide it. Verse 16, I thought to myself, look, I've grown and increased in wisdom more than anyone who's ruled over Jerusalem before me. I've experienced much of wisdom and knowledge. Then I applied myself to understanding of wisdom and also madness and folly, but I learned that this too is meaningless. It's a chasing after the wind. Basically, he's saying, I looked at the world. I tried to change the world. I couldn't change the world. So then I kind of looked, maybe I could study the world, what's happening in this world, almost like a psychologist or somebody kind of observing the world. And he's like, all I saw were people running around and everybody was like chasing after the wind. Nobody could change anything. The more I studied, the more I'm convinced that this life is meaningless. He has this final kind of conclusion of why he would come to that answer. Why this conclusion? Verse 18, he says, for with much wisdom comes much sorrow. The more knowledge, the more grief. He's like, as I looked at this world, I can't change it, but maybe I can understand it. And he's like, the problem is the more I studied it, the more it actually made me sad. The more I tried to understand and see what was happening in the world, the more knowledge I gained of the world, actually the more grief I had. He's like, if life's about what's in it for me, what do I get out of this world? And yet the more I study it, the more painful it is. Well, that's not getting me at all anything that I want. Meaningless, everything's meaningless. You might say, well, how does that work? The more knowledge, the more grief. It's actually true in so much of life. The more you understand, the more pain you experience. kind of a silly example, and then I'll hit some others. But I grew up in a little town called Estes Park, again in the mountains of Colorado, and we had a Taco Bell there. Any Taco Bell fans in here? Good. Be honest. I love Taco Bell. Okay, I'm not saying it's good food. It's not quality food, but I like Taco Bell. As a kid growing up, we ate Taco Bell all the time. It was like the cheapest place to eat in town. You could get a chili cheese burrito for like 75 cents. I don't know what they are now, but it was awesome. And we'd eat Taco Bell like at least 2 or 3 times a week. And you go to the Taco Bell. One of the interesting things was a bunch of the guys who worked there were like the seniors in high school. So it was kind of like the place you'd try to get a job at as you were going through high school. And so I was like a middle schooler, remember eating there all the time. One day we went to Taco Bell and the door was closed and it was locked and it had a sign on the front of the Taco Bell saying, closed, temporarily closed. We're like, bummer, we gotta find somewhere else to eat. We were excited to have our, chili cheese burritos and Taco Bell. Went the next day, still closed. Well, a little later we found out there was an article in the newspaper explaining why the Taco Bell had been closed. And it turns out that some guy had gone into the Taco Bell, and probably around when we'd gone in there, because we went a couple times a week, it was kind of a normal thing, go to Taco Bell. Guy went into the Taco Bell, he ordered a burrito, and these guys, working in the back, some guy made his burrito and actually cut his hand on like a knife while he was making the burrito, and he got some of the blood on the burrito. But he went ahead and just rolled it up and served it anyway, which is gross, right? And so the guy saw this as he was being, fed or given his burrito to buy, and he's like, I'm not going to buy that burrito. I saw you got blood on it. And the kind of cocky high schooler senior said, well, if you don't want this burrito, you can buy another burrito. I just made it for you. Whatever. He said something like that. So the guy was pretty smart. He took the burrito, took it home, froze it, sent it to Taco Bell headquarters. Sure enough, Taco Bell looked at it, found human DNA on it, there was blood, so they set up cameras around the Taco Bell, and over the next few days found these guys like picking their nose and flicking it in the meat, spitting in the beans, urinating in the food, and it was their inside joke that everybody in town was eating, this Taco Bell, and nobody knew it happened. And I'll tell you, that statement of Solomon's, with much wisdom come much sorrow. The more knowledge, the more grief. I read that article and I was just like, because I'm like, how many times have I eaten these guys' boogers, over the last few months? I'm like, that's horrible. Of course, that's a silly illustration, right? I know you guys are like, that's disgusting. It's a silly illustration, but the point is there's a lot of things in life where it's just easier not to know. I had a friend, I was just talking to him the other day, super smart guy. I was like, hey, do you watch the news? He's like, I don't like to watch the news. I'd rather just not know what's happening in the world. And to be honest, that's most people's perspective. Why would I watch the news? It's all depressing. Yes, truth is depressing. Like knowledge does bring pain. Some of you guys have probably been on missions trips to like poorer countries or something like third world country, and I've been on some. And you go and you learn things and you see things, you gain wisdom, you gain knowledge. But you know what comes with it? Sorrow, pain. And sometimes you go home and you're like, man, I wish I didn't see what I saw. Because I've got to choose right now. Do I live differently or do I live the same? And that creates sorrow and pain. I had a friend who I was teaching high school, and one of my students went to Bible school in Germany. Amazing time, life change. And he came back, he was so excited. He'd grown in knowledge and wisdom. And it was about a year later, he called me up and he's like, hey, Dan. I'm like, hey, how's it going? He's like, hey, I'm wondering if you would be willing to officiate my wedding. I'm engaged to a girl. I'm like, oh, sweet, awesome, tell me about it. As I begin, I can tell he's starting to feel pretty awkward about this relationship. I'm like, man, what's going on? And he's like, ultimately, he's like, well, we've been living together for like 6 months or something. I'm like, what are you doing? You know that. He's like, I know. He's like, I've been living, I don't know what to do. I'm afraid if I want to move out, she's going to break up with me. I'm like, and you're engaged? Like, this sounds like something you need to really work through. And it was amazing as we talked through it. I could tell he had been going through months and months of agony because he knew. He's like, it's not right what we're doing. He had gained knowledge, but with knowledge comes pain. With wisdom comes sorrow. And so as Solomon is looking at life and he's like, hey, you can't change the world, but maybe you can understand it, maybe you can learn about it. But the more he looks at the world, the more he kind of goes out his back door, the more you go around Kauai and you go away from the kind of fancy parts of town and the tourist parts of town, and you actually see the pain and the hurt. You're like, Kauai doesn't look as beautiful as it did before. Because you realize there's a lot of pain, and there's a lot of hurt, and there's a lot of history, from cultures. And I mean, there's so much wrapped up in a place like this. Any place, it doesn't matter where you are. And you're like, I kind of liked it when it was just nice and simple and a great place to go visit. I don't know if I want the pain of actually knowing what's happening. And I think for Solomon, when life's about what's in it for me, what does he get out of it? What does a man gain? He's like, it's not worth knowing. I'd rather be ignorant, because to know is to have pain, and to have wisdom is to have sorrow. It's interesting, I was thinking about that, and I was like, wow, what must it be like for us to have an all-knowing God? I mean, if God is omniscient, all-knowing, sometimes we can look at God and like, why would you do that? Don't you care? Natural disasters, whatever it might be that happens. But the Bible makes it clear, like, God is all-knowing. And if knowledge causes grief, how much pain do you think the Lord has? To truly know the depths of the darkness and the hurt in people's lives. I mean, I think that is why the cross was so necessary. Like, he knew the pain. He knew the hurt. And yet it wasn't just for him. He knew it for us. For the joy set before him, it says in Hebrews, he despised the shame. This joy of what we would have, and came to the cross. Solomon is not there. Solomon's like, what does a man gain? What's in it for me when I look at wisdom? When I look at knowledge, if I'm going to study the world, he's like, maybe that's my answer to life. Maybe that'll give me all that. Maybe a philosopher, let me be smart. I think of a lot of you guys are going to go from here, go to university. Maybe you have friends in university, and they're getting super smart. And you're like, wow, they're really moving along. To be honest, if it's just being smart and understanding the world for yourself, according to Solomon, it's going to end up leaving you pain and sorrow. If the goal is what's in it for me. And Solomon leaves saying it's like chasing after the wind, meaningless. It's all meaningless. It leads me to this question. We'll end with this. What happened to Solomon's wisdom from God? I mean, if Solomon says meaningless, everything's meaningless. If he says you're not significant, you can't change the world. So maybe you can understand the world. Maybe you should study it. But actually, the more you study the world, the more sorrow and the more pain you have. And you're like, what? I thought he was wise. I thought God gave him wisdom. Why would he say wisdom is bad in this section? And I remember asking that question for a long time, and then I came across this passage in James. And it helped get some perspective, I think, on what was going on with Solomon. James 3:13, it says, who is wise and understanding among you? Solomon was. Let him show it. Let him show his wisdom by their good life, by deeds done in humility that comes from wisdom. If you watch the story of Solomon through Kings and Chronicles, he goes from being a humble young man to, as he gets wealthy, as he builds more, as he gets more popular, he became harsh and mean and conniving and turned away from the Lord. And you're like, wow, things began to change. Verse 14, but if you harbor bitter envy and selfish ambition in your hearts, which you see in Solomon's older life, do not boast about it or deny the truth. Such wisdom does not come down from heaven, but is earthly, unspiritual, and demonic. It's not that God gave Solomon wisdom and then his wisdom turned him evil. It's God gave Solomon wisdom from heaven, a hearing heart, but over time, Solomon began to welcome a wisdom from the world. A wisdom that puts self at the center, not God at the center. And it says this wisdom does not come from heaven. It's earthly, it's unspiritual, it's demonic. For where you have envy and selfish ambition, there you find disorder and every evil practice. But the wisdom that comes from heaven is first of all pure, then peace-loving, considerate, submissive, full of mercy and good fruit, impartial and sincere. Peacemakers who sow in peace reap a harvest of righteousness. You're like, that's not the Solomon in his older age. He traded this wisdom from above that came with humility for a wisdom of the world that says, what do I get? What's in it for me? And it left him bitter and angry at everyone. What's his dilemma? His second dilemma? It's the disappointment of wisdom. First one is the insignificance of life. These things that he looks at life and he's like, I just can't stand this. First one, you can't change the world. Second one, even when you try to understand the world, it just hurts more. It just creates more pain in your life. You'd rather just not know. He's going to keep going. Tomorrow we'll hit his next two dilemmas and his conclusion of those dilemmas before we kind of dive in to the discussion. But this is where he's beginning. Let me pray. Lord, I do thank you that as we see this truth and as we recognize it actually in our own hearts, that it is often with wisdom and with knowledge, the more we understand of what's going on in people's lives, the more we feel their pain, the more we know their grief, Lord. And I pray that we wouldn't be afraid to embrace people's pain, Lord, because you weren't. I think of you as all-knowing, omniscient. Lord, and in that reality of knowing the depths of our pain, you dove into our world, Lord, to live that life of pain, not because it was good for you, but because it was a gift for us, Lord. We thank you in your name. Amen. All right.
Thank you.